Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I've got for you a conversation I had with Dr. Steve Turley on the subject of what do religious societies actually look like? Because there are a lot of misconceptions about what they tend to look like. Now, I've spoken with Dr. Turley in the past. His research includes looking at the global resurgence of religion. And it was a great conversation, the previous one that we've had. So I invited him back and he graciously accepted. And we talked more and had a very interesting conversation. Let me read you his biography, just in case you missed the previous conversation. Steve Turley is an internationally recognized scholar, speaker, and classical guitarist. He is the author of Awakening Wonder, a classical guide to truth, goodness, and beauty, and the ritualized revelation of the Messianic Age, Washings and Meals in Galatians and 1 Corinthians. Steve blogs on the church, society and culture, education, and the arts at turleytalks.com. He is a faculty member at Tall Oaks Classical School in Newcastle, Delaware, where he teaches theology, Greek, and rhetoric, and a professor of the fine arts at Eastern University. Steve lectures at universities, conferences, and churches throughout the U.S. and abroad. His research and writings have appeared in such journals as Christianity and Literature, Calvin Theological Journal, First Things, Touchstone, and the Chesterton Review. He and his wife, Kiko, have 4 children and live in Newark, Delaware, where they together enjoy fishing, gardening, and watching Duck Dynasty marathons. So, it's a really interesting subject, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. All right, well, thank you very much for joining me. A topic we had touched on in our previous conversation was one of what religious societies actually look like in practice, because I think there's a very common misconception that comes both from knowing extremely little history, which is very common, and people who don't know much history writing a lot of fiction, also people who are very lazy writing fiction, where they portray religious societies on a very, very narrow pattern that is only a tiny minority of religious societies that have ever been, like Puritan New England or the Iran under the Ayatollah Khomeini. Societies like that where there's a theocracy which imposes an incredibly uniform way of life on everybody, sort of cookie cutter, trying to be a cookie cutter, stamping out everyone is exactly the same. So I'd like to continue that subject. What do religious societies actually look like, as opposed to the sort of stereotype that I think a lot of people are today familiar with?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris, because I do think there's a lot of confusion there. I think partly the reason why there's so much confusion is because there's this whole question over what the whole term religious society means, right? And you and I have talked about this before. What we have to understand, classically speaking, religion is not a term that means what we think it means today. We tend to think of religion as just your personal private beliefs about some deity or supernatural beings or what have you. But historically, religion had to do with social obligations and indeed social order. So religio, the Latin term, comes from these 2 terms, religare, to retie or rebind, having to do with retying and rebinding your social obligation. I like to point out to my students, when you get from grandma that wonderful card on your birthday sent to you with a nice big check in there, what's the first thing your mom tells you to do? Who do you have to call now? You got to call grandma. It is your moral obligation, your social obligation to do that. That's religion. Historically speaking, that's religion. So in that sense, then, in many respects, all societies are religious. Again, you and I talked about a fellow by the name of Durkheim, Emile Durkheim, who's a sociologist at the dawn of the 20th century. And he argued that all societies are ultimately rooted in faith. They're rooted in something called the sacred. And the sacred are rules, understandings, and goals considered absolute and unquestionable. That's how they're set apart. That's how they're sacred. And you can be skeptical and you can doubt all the rules and goals you want that are outside of the sacred. So if you go to used car salesman, you can be Mr. Skeptical 101. But the moment you buy the car and then you're driving down the road and you get pulled over by a police officer, that skepticism, that doubt disappears. You don't get to look at that police officer and say, I don't like that law. That law offends me. No, thank you. I don't need your services today. Because those are rules, understandings, and goals that are valid irrespective of my personal opinion. And every society is rooted in such rules, understandings, and goals that are thereby able to organize and govern social, demographic, economic, political life. So in many respects, all societies are religious. What is interesting today is we're in a society that's self-consciously trying not to be religious, or to at least redefine religion in such a way now it's going to be a part of our social order, and we're going to consign it a place in that social order where it doesn't have a lot to do with our public institutions, the way our state runs, the way our education runs, the way our business practice run, and the like. So and so we tend to then create as a result some caricatures of religious society that I think are ironically quite inaccurate. And then I think that's where I would start with making sure we understand when we're talking about sort of the revitalization of perhaps, say, classical religious societies, Christian societies, Islamic societies, Buddhist, Hindu, and the like. They're going to actually end up looking like something very different than the caricatures we've created for them, given our redefinition of religion.
So, I think a good place to go next with that is some examples of what religious societies look like. Possibly, whether a classic or a contemporary, of what did the sort of the religio, what did the social rules of life look like, and what didn't they look? What did they shape and what didn't they shape within a person's ordinary life?
Yeah, boy, right. Where do you start there, right? If you take, for example, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Actually, well, you had mentioned, and I think it actually would be a good place to start. Come to think of it, is you had mentioned Poland is instituting a practice of no shopping on Sundays. And so I think it'd be interesting to look at sort of at both halves of what does that what does that constrain, what does it do, and what doesn't it constrain, what doesn't it do?
No, it's fantastic. Okay, so we tend to be in the West today. What we're exporting to the rest of the world is a consumer-based society, and consumer societies see shopping the way Las Vegas sees gambling. It wants to get rid of the clock, as it were, and and get rid of windows and just have you shopping 24/7. 7, right? What you're seeing there is a particular notion of time, where time is there reconstructed around, say, the 5-day work week where we make our money. And then we have the weekend, and the weekend is for recreation. What Poland is trying to do is it's trying to, as well as Russia, it's trying to draw back this notion of time far more in a sacred sense, so that Sunday isn't so much part of a weekend. Sunday is actually really the first day of the week. If you look at a lot of business calendars, they'll start on Mondays. All right. Sunday is not the first day of the week, but classically speaking, in Christian consciousness, Sunday is the first day of the week because it signifies the first day of the new creation. It also has the significance of this 8th day notion. You're familiar with that? So God creates the world in 6 days. He blesses it on the 7th day, but we mess it up. So the Jewish imagination said there must be an 8th day to liberate us from this fall. And so the first thing we see Christians doing is moving the Sabbath, as it were, from the Shabbat, the 7th day, to Sunday, the first day of the new week, but the 8th day of the previous week. David Clayton is a wonderful, the Catholic scholar, is a wonderful article on the 8th day online that you can find. Alexander Schmemann as well, and from an Orthodox perspective. This is one of the rationales of why we worship on Sunday. So in Islam, it's Friday, and Judaism, it's Saturday, but in Christianity, it's Sunday. It's the 8th day. And so what Poland's trying to do is it's trying to bring that back into people's consciousness, this notion that this is a day not for recreation. It's not a day for consumerism. No, it's a day for worship, for contemplation, for true leisure, as Joseph Pieper would say. leisure being doing those things that are their own justification, their own reward, poetry, music, art, literature, and the like. So
looking at a tree and noticing it's beautiful.
yeah, you got it. So that's what we're already seeing now are attempts now to reconfigure time more around this more humane conception of life. Today in our cultures, Western cultures, where it's Sunday is part of the weekend. You can do things on Sunday you can't do on Monday morning, like schedule a volleyball game. No one is scheduling a high school volleyball game at 9 a.m. Monday morning, and that's because that's the sacred of a consumer-based society, which is a professional day or a work day. We even have that now, don't we? When I order something on Amazon, I say this will take 2 to 3, 5 business days. So business days are now defining our calendar more than, say, liturgies, sacred time, and the like. Poland, Russia, India, they're trying to reverse that now to a much more traditionalist, and I think a far more humane conception of time.
There's some interesting things to say about that conception of time. Because the curious thing about our 5 and 2 workday versus weekend is that it almost has the sense of there being essentially 2 weeks that simply alternate between the two of each other, one of them longer than the other. That it doesn't, the classic idea that you get from the Jewish Sabbath and then the Christianity moving the Sabbath over one day but still having a Sabbath was that you have a week, but then you have a rest from the week going back into it. Whereas the curious thing about our 2-day weekend is that it's long enough that it becomes its own thing, where instead of, I find, having small children, there are times when I'm looking forward to the weekend finally being over so I can sort of rest a little bit on the sort of, more endurable level of the work week. Just because the weekend is being short, it's a sort of high intensity of this is when we cram all the things we want to do in. And in the work week, well, when work's over, family spends time together for a few hours before bedtime, but you don't have enough time to cram lots of things in there, so you actually get to relax a little bit before you go to sleep. Whereas on weekends, there's so many things to fit in that it ceases to have it ceases to be a cycle and becomes two competing. I mean, it is cyclical of its nature because the one thing follows the other regularly, but it has less of that cycle, a feeling of human cyclality to it, and more of the feeling of, okay, my normal job is over, it's time to go to my second job of having fun on the weekend.
Yeah, I think you've got it. That I love how you put it there. I've got the job of pressing buttons at work or whatever it is, sending emails. Now I've got my other job, which is now I have to be a parent and I have to deal with my kids now. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of buttons to push for that one, to resolve it there.
Yeah. Well, it can vary too. Now I've got the job of being social. And
yes.
There are people who have, I've noticed, who have deep obligations to go to parties and do other things where, they're all still jobs in a sense.
This is precisely, I think, again, it was Josef Pieper who pointed this out. It's precisely the price we pay when we put a primacy on a career-based, consumer-based society. We begin to reevaluate life from that lens. Whereas historically, we thought of life first and foremost as worship. First and foremost, it is sacrament, and then it is, as it were, your work, your vocation, and the like. It starts on Sunday and then moves into Monday. Or as like you mentioned, the Jewish notion, where the day actually begins in the evening. It starts in rest and then begins in work. And I think the term vacation is an interesting one, because what are we vacating? Right. As opposed to, and I think this was Bill Cavanaugh who did work in this, as opposed to the pilgrimage. Vacations are secular, pilgrimages are sacred. And what we're finding when St. Nicholas's relics came to Moscow and St. Petersburg and so forth, they were saying they were lines that were stretched quite literally 2 miles long to see it. We were talking millions upon millions of Russians coming to see and venerate these relics. And I wrote an article on there, or did a video on how the pilgrimage was making a comeback in Russia. And this was before Rodney Stark's study that came out on European pilgrimages at sacred sites throughout Western Europe. This is key, Western Europe. And they're finding that they're at an all-time high now. They're an all-time record of people visiting these sacred sites, Lourdes in France and so on. And these are not necessarily people international. These are Western Europeans redefining vacations now more in terms of pilgrimages. So this is, again, just a fascinating insight to sort of this rediscovery of a sacred notion of time.
That's very interesting. Two very related things come to mind there. That though I've never read it, tiny bits of it. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a tale of making a pilgrimage where once enough pilgrims come through, then there become various fun things that you do on the way. But it was still on the way of the pilgrimage.
Right.
But it also reminds me of something Chesterton said, where he was talking about the notions of government, that somewhere has arisen this idea that two people originated a government by having a contract of exchanging mutual rights. And he said, there's no record of this anywhere. There are plenty of records of people, if you don't hit me, I won't hit you. There's no record of that anywhere. There are lots of records of people saying we must not hit each other on the sacred place, or on the holy place.
Yeah.
And it had some great line about, man held a day holy and found he had a holiday. And so there's something interesting, and it relates to something I found very fascinating you said the last time we spoke, about how the problem with the consumer society is that everything has the value you invest into it. Nothing has its value. You don't receive value from anything. You give value to all of the things by wanting them, by desiring them, by being willing to trade for them. And there's something, the pilgrimage, though there may be plenty of enjoyable things to do along the pilgrimage, they derive in some sense, in a psychological sense, they derive their value from the fact that you are there to do something more important. And so there's, I think, a strong element of human psychology that a thing worth doing can support a lot of things that aren't really worth doing and sort of make them a little bit, at least, worth doing. Whereas if nothing's worth doing, at some point you're just going to stop bothering.
Yeah. If I could just go on top, because I think it's what you just said is beautiful. It goes back to this. The listeners, I think, might be helped with the old Greek distinction between Kairos and Chronos. So Chronos is consecutive quantitative time. It's 1 o'clock, it's 2 o'clock, it's 3 o'clock. But Kairos is qualitative time. It's Christmas. It's Easter, right? It's Lent. So if I asked you, Chris, how was your Christmas? And you said, about 24 hours. I'd say, okay, well, obviously it was really good. Got quite the hangover there, I see. So yeah, you would be mistaking my Kairos-oriented question with Chronos. We tend to be a Chronos-oriented culture, whereas, like you're saying, Chaucer and others, they were fundamentally a Kairos-based culture. So they had Chronos. We got to meet at some time. They had Chronos, but the Chronos was going somewhere, and that's Kairos. And I think we're seeing a rediscovery of Kairos today.
Yeah, it's a curious thing. I've noticed. You see it. The internet, I think, selects to some degree for that people who don't have a good sense of why they're doing what they're doing are, in some sense, less to be found out doing it, and therefore you can find a higher concentration of them in some places where you don't have as much a sense. Because I've encountered a lot of people who. Amongst the atheists online, one finds a lot of this. Well, what do you need a purpose in life for? Which is a really kind of curious question in some regards, and it speaks to a curious sort of simplicity, in the more neutral sense of the word simplicity, of almost like the way horses in a line, follow the tail in front of them, except for the one in front. Of people who just have some pattern, they're just following this pattern, and they've got no idea why, but that's sort of as far as they got. That it I suppose it's part of the cyclicality of life, actually. That when you're born, when you're young, you don't make many decisions. The decisions you can make are very, very constrained. But at some point, you become the person who does start making the decisions. At which point, you need to have some idea of what the heck, where are you trying to go, as you decide which direction you're walking in. So now something related to that. That you had talked about with the distributist recently was, how did you put it? It was, know where you're going. You'd been talking about oh shoot, I can't believe my memory is failing me like this. It was the sense of,
welcome to old age.
Oh man, I can't believe I had the idea a moment ago and I got distracted by something else trying to introduce it.
Yeah.
I'm terribly sorry.
No, that's all right. It happens to me all the time. I could never fail you for that. So I was talking to the distributist, and we were talking earlier about horses following tails. You had something in your head. Was it on business? Was it on Trump? Was it on?
No, it was sort of on that idea of knowing where you're going. Or having a sense of where you're going, but unfortunately, it's sort of escaping me. So I'll just go with the metaphor of the cursing of repentance in Greek being metanoete, more literally turn yourself around. And so one of it was on, that's right, society turning itself around, and the mechanism for it being what you were talking to the distributist about was postmodernism having that interesting thing that it turned modernism on itself.
Yes, yeah.
And then destroyed itself. And then having done so, it leaves people in the position of that they're, modernism destroyed all directions, but we've got the modern direction. Science will lead us into the glorious future. And then the very fascinating point of then postmodernism turned on it and said, is it?
Really? Yeah, exactly. Modernity is so unique in the sense that it was rooted, philosophically speaking, it's rooted in doubt. It's one of the, I can't think of another belief system where its basic starting point is, well, how do you know? And supposedly, in Cartesian fashion, scientific rationalism was going to rescue us from that doubt. It was going to dispel doubts, and we can then be certain of everything here on in. And of course, religion and the rituals and the holy days, well, those are gone, because what do you need them for? Show me, explain that to me, right? I doubt skepticism. And postmodernism comes along and just takes that doubt and just turns it just a little bit on scientific rationalism and says, well, how do we scientifically know scientific rationalism? And it just ends up collapsing. Or as the positivists, if something's not empirical, then we can't know it. Well, how do you know that empirically? Oops. And so, you got it. Postmodernity is the fruit of secularism, of its own doubt and skepticism just simply turned on itself. So leading it then to the whole Durkheim notion of the sacred, like we began our conversation with. Secularism, by definition, cannot have a sustainable sacred. By definition, if the sacred is that which is unquestionable, and secularism, like the bumper sticker says, question everything, it's gone. Its own sacred, its own sanctified vision of rules, understandings, and goals considered absolute and unquestionable end up collapsing under the weight of something like postmodernity.
There's actually a really good physical metaphor for that too, in that sacred being set apart and secular being what's normal. What's normal cannot, by definition, be set apart.
Right. You got it. Or natural, or things like that. Yeah.
Which really gets to there's an interesting echo of that in the fact that a human being is both a body and spirit united. And so having, in a sense, two natures united into one nature we need two kinds of living, the secular and the sacred. We need to work by the sweat of our brow to earn our bread, but we also need to be doing something else too. And that secularism's great folly, great problem, has been to think that it's possible, in a sense, to have a 7-day work week and make that work. It's just 2 of those days happen to be a different sort of job.
Right.
But that it's
yeah. No, it's brilliant, and I like how you're bringing back the medieval understanding of the seculum. That's a lovely way of thinking of it, right? Your vocation, your work, and so on. That's good, yeah. But it's good because of the incarnation. It is good because it is linked to the sacred, and the sacred becomes the unquestionable basis by which then our secular is able to be meaningful, purposeful, transfigurative, and humane.
And a really good way to make this concrete for people who are viewing, because I can almost hear the atheists saying, but why do you need any of that? A really good place where you see this come up a lot is if you know non-religious people who have children, they pretty much all struggle with the question of, does it really make sense to bring a child into this world with all the problems of this world?
Yeah.
And I think, well, you'll find some people who are sort of acting on pure instinct and not thinking about anything whatsoever. But as long as you're not talking about people who have approximately no thoughts in their head, anyone contemplating having a child intentionally who does not have faith in God, that whatever happens, we know that our children may live in a dangerous world, our children may live in a bad world, but we do know that our children can have eternal life. We do know that our children can be saints, and that a man can be a saint in any age. We have faith in God of that, and therefore it is good to have children, because they, however bad the world may be, there's a lot more than just the world. When you don't have any of that, when you just look at the world and think like, well, my life was pretty comfortable, but things sure seem to be disintegrating around us, and there are trials and hardships, and if people know the right thing, antibiotic resistance is going up, disease may become more prevalent, and so on. They all struggle with that. And it's a good example, I think, of where the sacred can justify the secular, but the secular has a very hard time justifying itself.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Again, given the seculars by itself, it's how do I want to say, it's dislodging from any kind of sacred foundation. It ends up just becoming just this recursive skepticism that then breeds postmodernism. So it ends up just becoming, I think, an unsustainable. I mean, I've wrestled with this because I come from a very secular background. I've really thought this through. I've reading scholars on it. I mean, more and more, I just don't see any way around it. The secular is simply an unsustainable belief system and social order. And so the question is not whether or not we're going to have a secular society. The question is, what other kind of society is going to emerge? That really, in the end, is the only question. And in the meantime, we have to deal with a lot of the rot of secularism.
Yeah, well, a good example of where the secular can't sustain itself is simply in the question of, why should any two people compromise? Oh, pardon. Thought I had the do not disturb. But yeah, the question of why should two people compromise? Because secularism would work just fine if all people are identical. If there are no differences between human beings of any kind, then everyone could get along just fine. But the problem is when you have two people who want different things, why should they compromise?
Right.
I mean, unless, except in the barest sense of where the two need each other in some fashion, so have to come to some agreement. But where they don't, why should they work together?
Right.
Because if you have some transcendent goal that all of you are
teleology,
then you will work together with each other. You'll set aside things that you want for greater goods, if there is some greater good.
That was Yeah, Lewis's argument in Abolition of Man, right? Chapter 2, why should I save humanity unless I first assume that humanity ought to be saved?
Yeah.
Well, where did I get that ought? And wherever you go, you're going to have to at some point come to a transcendent frame of reference that exceeds beyond the limits of doubt.
No, it's that's a really good way of putting it, because you can't. Doubt doesn't get you anywhere. Doubt doesn't get you to a conclusion, and you need a conclusion for an action
Right.
to follow.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it. I'm reminded of the Chinese philosopher Yangchu, I think it was called. I'm close to pronouncing that right. Who was famous and very on within Chinese philosophy for his radical philosophical selfishness. And he had a saying that if plucking one hair from his forearm would save the kingdom, he wouldn't do it, because what's the kingdom to him?
Right.
Now, he didn't catch on very well. He wasn't very popular as a philosopher.
Right.
But it actually gets to it. You can't be. You radical selfishness can't be a popular philosophy.
Right.
Because
you got it. No, you got it. I think you nailed it. Yeah.
It'll implode on itself. So now, so we talked about the positive side, what the Polish law is aiming to create. So I think it'd be good to balance that out with what the Polish law isn't aiming to create. I mean, a good symbol for which being the shops are open the other 6 days.
Right.
So, but do you want to talk about that a little bit? The space that's left open for other things. Once you set aside some time for sacred, you still set up a lot of time for other things, and in general, religious tolerance of variation.
No, I think it's a fantastic question, and I think it just fits in so well with what we've been talking about, because what we have to understand, I think, is we don't want to see religion or religious society necessarily, at least, as sort of this Taliban-esque, Puritan-like society. Even I think the Puritans get a rough. One of the coolest things about the Puritans is actually that I've found out is they actually had sermons on sex, and there you go. Now that's a Puritan commonwealth, right? Now they drank hard. They loved their music and at home and the like, and so they get a bit of a bad rap too. But nevertheless, I think what we have to understand is that with the fall of secularism, particularly with communism on the one hand, and with what we're seeing with the fall of sort of the Westocentric globalism on the other, is people like Lyotard onward in 1979, people have been looking for meta-narratives. The meta-narrative has died. So the meta-narrative of communism has died. The meta-narrative increasingly of a secular rationalist society has died. So people have collapsed into this postmodern tribalism that we're seeing on our university campuses, or we're seeing kind of in balkanizing tendencies, perhaps in Europe and the like. But in the process, globalization hasn't disappeared. Globalization in many ways is more powerful than it's ever been. And so now you're seeing this blowback against globalization and its anti-cultural processes, its anti-national part that you and I think we were talking about in our last time together. And in this blowback, the tribalisms are kind of getting reorganized now around nationalism, and they're rediscovering a meta-narrative. And the meta-narrative is nation, it's sacrament, it's soil, it's pre-beliefs, or pre-modern beliefs and practices that are pre-modern by definition, because they have to transcend modernist doubt and skepticism. So they're pre-modern, and now because they're mass and collective, they're now providing a meta-narrative that micro-narratives are finding that they, generally speaking, can live quite comfortably under. So you've got your uniformity that's more at the civic level, meta-narrative level, but then you have your pluriformity, you have your plurality and so forth at micro levels. That's what we're finding in Russia, we're finding in Hungary, in Poland, in Slovakia, with strictures. I mean, so we might see micro allegiances in sort of LGBT movements and the like, whereas these cultures are not, because of their meta-narrative. The meta-narrative is going to say, no, 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 we don't go there, but we're certainly going to be flourishing in education. We're certainly going to be flourishing in our pronatalism and fertility. We're certainly going to be flourishing in renewed sense of national sport and blah, blah, blah. There's going to be all these other ways of expressing it. But I don't think that a religious nation necessarily means, you know, the persecution of every minority out there. I think it's a macro, generally speaking, it's a macro narrative, what we call our meta narrative, that's replacing the loss, the implosion of the secular meta narrative, either in the form of communism in the Soviet East and Eastern Bloc nations, or in the form of sort of the promise of the Fukuyama promise of liberal democracy and the end of history in the West. Those are broken down, and they're being rediscovered through the revival of kind of a religious nationalism.
Now, there's another interesting thing tying in with that original sense of religious, and also when you mentioned balkanization, that the tendency towards divesting back towards smaller things like the Scottish independence movement, which isn't there good reason to believe that may well, because I thought the demographics are somewhat suggestive that it didn't happen this time, but it may well in the next 10, 20, 30 years, that it looks like steam's gathering on that rather than dissipating. And the various ideas that people are separating into groups that have enough in common to be able to establish communal rituals.
Right.
And secular rituals, secular in the original medieval sense of secular. Civic rituals, yes. Thank you. I read this, it was kind of amusing, but interesting story about a woman in Switzerland. And she was an immigrant, she was a German immigrant to Switzerland. And her children were born there, but she was applying for citizenship, and her neighbors all, because within Switzerland, your neighbors can actually have input on this, and her neighbors all said, no, there is no way, she's not sufficiently Swiss, because she did things like tried to complain about their traditions of things with their Swiss cows and the bells on them, and they're looking at this and saying, translating somewhat, and I don't mean from language, but just the particulars into sort of more generals. If you're not going to take part in our rituals, you're not one of us.
Right.
And so, as much as having cows, and, wearing bells, doing certain things, we think of them as cultural traditions. In a sense, they're civic rituals, and ritual binds those who take part in a ritual. So, would you say
which leads us back to the original definition of religion? You got it.
Exactly, and would you say that does seem to be that the tendency to drive apart is into groups who have enough in common they can have civic ritual?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, secession. Stepan Mostrovich of Texas A&M has written extensively on this. Secession is the tendency today. We have now 35 new nations since 1991, the breakup of the Soviet Union. Everything from Burundi to Rwanda to South Sudan to Scotland, as you mentioned, to Slovakia, from Brexit to Texas to New California, as they're calling it, right? Trying to get that. Those are the tendencies today. You got it. The tendency is to look inward for the basis of identity and social order. I don't think it's enough to call. Some people have been calling this sort of the triumph of identity politics and tribalism. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think the identity politics or the tribalism, whatever, is morphing more and more into, again, a meta-narrative, a common meta-narrative. Because even among homogeneously ethnic groups like the Japanese, you still have a thoroughly feudalist society. You still have to have some kind of civic nationalism. It's not all ethnic nationalism, right? Because certain families are going to have precedence, certain areas are going to have precedence, certain occupations are going to have. You're still going to have some kind of social stratification that you have to wrestle with. Who is going to run this people and all of a sudden now you have a whole different kind of racism involved in that.
Well, Japan's
Race,
interesting.
yeah,
You have a lot of experience with Japan, correct?
yeah. My wife is from Tokyo. Yeah.
No, my understanding was that there actually is some stigma about Japanese people who've lived abroad for too long, that and then come back because they will tend to lose some of their. If you spend 10, 20 years away, you'll tend to lose a little bit of what just came naturally. You also tend to pick up some of what is foreign, so that even though a person who is and to this effect, I've heard about like in Japanese businessmen, for example, who are stationed in some place like New York, will tend to congregate and stay together, and they keep speaking Japanese with each other, and do things that sort of ward off that cultural exchange, so that when they go home, they're still very recognizably culturally Japanese.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how much of that is actually the case, because if it is true, it does point very strongly to where no matter how long you've lived outside of Japan, you're still ethnically Japanese, obviously,
Right.
but you cease to be culturally Japanese as you don't speak Japanese and speak a different language, and you start to sound funny. And my grandfather was a Greek up to his 20s. He lived in Greece. He was a Greek peasant growing up, and around his 80s, he could barely speak Greek coherently anymore. I mean, just too many English words were creeping in, because that's what 40 years of speaking English, or actually no, it's more like 60 years at that point of speaking English will do to you, even though that was the only language you knew growing up. So how much is that the case, and does it point to the importance of the cultural unity rather than ethnic unity, even in Japan?
Yeah, you caught it. You caught it. I think there's a whole New Testament basis for this as well. But I do think you have to make a distinction between sort of ethno-nationalism, perhaps cultural nationalism, or sometimes we call it civic nationalism. Yeah, you caught it there. Yeah, I know there's an Indian proverb that someone, as you described, they say he's been gone for a while, they would call him a local bird with a foreign walk. Of course, yeah, you get that in Japan as well, because the society's culture is so regimented through ritualistic interaction. It's easy to lose. I mean, it's hard to acquire it, and it's easy to lose it. And if you lose it, yeah, it's inadvertently considered rude. And so that's just the natural pressure, I think, that someone who's been gone from a place like Japan for so long and then comes back, that's what they're going to feel. They're going to figure out, oh, that's right, I've got to do this. Oh, I'm supposed to do that. I forgot. When I'm talking to this person, I'm supposed to use this form. I forgot. Yeah, you got it. And again, the inadvertent sense is when you don't do it and you are Japanese, that it's rude. So there is a natural interlocking link between ethnic identity and cultural identity. But they are distinct, as you just said. You can go off into Canada for a number of years and maintain that ethnicity, but lose some of that cultural specificity that you would have otherwise. And I think that's what's happening. I do think you're seeing a lot of ethnic nationalism, but I think what's driving it more, at least at this point, is more of a civic or cultural nationalism, where like-minded people or who generally live within proximity to each other, of course, are basically saying, you know what, I don't think we need NATO or the EU. Certainly not the EU. That's been a disaster. I mean, but Europeans will tell you that. We don't need these meta institutions to define our cultural identity or the meta narrative by which we live. No, we're going to go back to our customs, our traditions, our ways of life before the rise of the modern age. Certainly we'll still have globalism and technology and the like, but it's going to be much more of a servant. It's not going to be a master. That's really what's driving a lot of this. And it's just getting bigger and bigger. It's not going away because the globalistic pressures and the secular pressures aren't going away.
Yeah, actually, it brings up an interesting point, just to distinguish ethnic nationalism from cultural nationalism.
Cultural, yeah.
Because here in America, we're in a very strange sort of circumstance. But you get a fellow like a Richard Spencer who's got an idea of some sort of ethnic nationalism. I'm not very familiar with him. My understanding is that he doesn't even have particularly well developed ideas in terms of even what the ethnicities are, but that what he wants is this ethnic nationalism at the expense of a cultural nationalism. That he wants to separate people who have separate people who have the same culture simply based on their ethnicity, which that's really where, I mean, it seems to me also that's, I mean, aside from several other reasons why the alt-right is kind of going nowhere, but that's one of the most fundamental, that somebody like a Richard Spencer, in valuing ethnic nationalism, not cultural nationalism, is asking somebody like me to, you know how you have a friend who looks a little different than you, but culturally you have a ton in common? You're supposed to now shun that person, even though you have more in common with him than you do with me, on the basis of we both sunburn more easily than he does. And I've never understood how it is that people can be proud of their ability to sunburn. But anyway, it just doesn't seem like a strength to me. But be that as it may, that seems to me to be a really important and critical distinction, and why I think the vast overwhelming majority of Americans, aside from particular national characters, simply hear that sort of thing with a certain amount of repugnance, because it's violating a cultural nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
It's saying that your culture doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
That what matters is something other than your culture, and that feels wrong to a human being, to say your culture, it doesn't matter. Your culture doesn't have to do with who is, with your identity, or how much you share with somebody else.
Yeah, Robert Wuthnow did a study on the restructuring of American religion, and I think it was published in 1988. And he looked at what's been going on in the American churches since the end of World War II. And his conclusion was that we have been restructuring around conservative versus liberal lines. So back in the day, it would have been around denominational lines. So Catholics hung out with Catholics, Methodists hung out with Methodists, Baptists hung out with Baptists, Mormons hung out with Mormons, on and on. What he was finding was so fascinating, this is before even kind of the Mitt Romney, Glenn Beck time, was that now it was more conservatives were hanging out with conservatives and liberals were hanging out with liberals. So a conservative Presbyterian would find he has, I mean, think about this, an inheritor of a descendant of John Calvin would find he has far more in common with a British journalist writing in the 1920s, one G.K. Chesterton, than he does with his fellow Presbyterians.
A Catholic British journalist.
Catholic, that's right. Yeah.
In the 1920s, he'd converted.
Oh, okay. There you go. Okay. So yeah, you got it. He has more. So a Presbyterian has more in common with a Roman Catholic than he does with his fellow Presbyterians, or even a Mormon will have more in common with a Southern Baptist than he does with his fellow Mormons. Although Mormonism is becoming almost entirely just a red religion, it's they're voting 98% or so Republican. But the point is that we are in 1960 campaign. John F. Kennedy had to say over and over and over again, "I will not let the Vatican interfere in our politics." When John Kerry was running in 2004, conservatives were so excited that more and more archbishops were saying he should be excommunicated for his political views. They're like, finally, now the Catholic Church is stepping up. So what we've seen a shift in our cultural nationalism. It is turned towards a very, and this is a really nice way of kind of tying up what we've been saying about what is a religious culture. We're seeing a very, very pluralistic, but a very pluralistic cultural nationalism emerge that's united around actually very, very central themes. And those themes tend to be nation, culture, tradition, populism, what have you. Yeah, I must admit, I don't know that much about the alt-right, but I don't see where ethnic nationalism fits into that very well. It's able to overcome that, where that's not necessarily the case with the left. The left is breaking up in so much into identity politics, ethnic nationalism, tribalization, Black Lives Matter, La Raza, feminism. It becomes a segmented belief system, but I think largely because they've lost their meta narrative. So that's why I tend to see why you'll hear me use terms like the age of the right and so forth emerging. So I tend to see conservatism as far stronger right now than anything secular globalism has to offer.
Having a meta narrative, you use the description of having strong roots.
Yeah,
And a meta narrative being, I think, in this case, the roots that enable you to grow.
exactly.
There's a really interesting tie into what you were saying about secularism earlier, and the poverty of secularism on its own. In particular, our commercial secularism. That in addition to the problem of you have to impose value by wanting the thing because there's everything on offer and anyone will sell anything to anyone. There's also, you mentioned that people need tradition. Just now you'd mentioned, and the thing that commercialism cannot do is tradition, because commercialism always has to be new, because they can't sell you what you already own.
You got it. Yeah.
You can have a few traditions, like you buy heart-shaped chocolates on Valentine's Day. So it can support a few very minor traditions like that, like at the same time each year you buy the same consumable. But most people don't trade in consumables, and you have to always be changing. You have to always be different to have a reason to buy a new version.
Go to a movie theater. Everything in a movie theater, all the icons surrounding you, right? Even the previews at the beginning of it, everything is all about what's new, what's tomorrow going to bring. It's entirely future driven.
By the way, I should explain for the benefit of people viewing who may never have been in an Orthodox church in which you are surrounded by icons. Right. The icons are pictures of the saints in a particular beautiful stylized fashion. And I believe you're referring to the movie posters that adorn all over the place within a movie theater. That if you just Google the inside of an Orthodox church, and you'll see, and there's some immediate visual similarities in the way you've got all these large pictures of people all over the place, except they're not specially good people in a movie theater.
Right. They're not saints. That's right.
Yes, they're people who are selected for. Saints are people who are selected for being specially good people. In a movie theater, they're selected for very different things.
That's right.
Than just that. So
maybe we'll get a movie, Chris. What do you think? I could see you and I on a poster. That'd be pretty cool.
That'd be a fun one. So I think that's it's we're hitting about an hour, which is a good length, and I think that really does sort of wrap, bring the conversation to a nice sort of point, echoing where it started about the nature of secularization and what. How culture provides, the religion provides the skeleton on which the rest of the body can be built, and without which it's a quivering mass on the ground that rapidly suffocates. And for us vertebrates on land, and so I think that's a really sort of good place that what religion does is it provides the framework, it provides the meaning, it provides things. There are things that it does forbid, but it also, in so doing, it also provides the space, because the things that forbid, to borrow the metaphor from a moment ago, is like your bones say that your lungs are not allowed to collapse,
right?
And that's what lets you breathe. And the fact that, yes, that's a limitation. Your lungs aren't allowed to just go flop, but that's very, very helpful if you plan to actually put air inside them.
Limitation,
yeah. So that's the sense in healthy religious societies of what the religion of the society does, is it provides you that framework. It provides limitations, but limitations in service of the flourishing of human life.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Exactly. I mean, we're really seeing an extraordinary renaissance of that in places like Russia, India, Poland, Hungary. We're getting tastes of it here. We're really seeing this sense that returning to the pre-modern, or perhaps better, the post-postmodern, right? Kind of going around in a circle. I think the postmodern is the pre-modern. Returning to that is the answer to a lot of the modernist secular angst that we're feeling today. And we're finding that are the basic materiality of our culture is beginning to be reconfigured around that. And I think in such a way that's going to usher in a lot of human flourishing. Certainly its own problems too. I mean, humans never fail to disappoint, but
No, we don't.
but also at least being able to carry on the conversation that we had for so many thousands of years. A return to that is something that is very promising.
Yeah. And a good example of that, providing the answers. It's funny how often, like you see during the Me Too movement, of like people should treat women with respect, and you see tons of Christians going, "Hey, we've been saying that all along." And
we said that on Easter morning, right? Mary, it is I. Yeah.
yeah, and again that in the aftermath of there's that fellow Aziz Ansari who had someone wrote up her terrible sexual experiences with him, and you see think pieces coming out about that. Maybe the goal shouldn't be to just stay on this side of illegal, on the legal side of illegal and not cross the line. Maybe you should strive to be better than that. And all the Christians jump up and down. Yeah, you really should.
Welcome home. That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So it's funny to increasingly you see things where people are discovering, that this completely directionless society doesn't work very well, and here we are saying, we know.
Scholars are coming out. They're not hard studies, but they're suggestive studies. They're coming out and saying that postmoderns are particularly prone to retraditionalization because postmoderns have this sort of schizophrenic belief system that is rootless, and they have lives that are fractured, and the ancient traditions provide precisely the holistic conception of life that resolves those tensions. So it seems postmodernism just naturally leads ultimately to this postmodernism, which would be retraditionalization.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's been a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Chris. God bless.
God bless. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching that conversation as much as I enjoyed being in it. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.